All right, let us begin. Another wonderful event in our Reading with Jane Austen series. Welcome, everyone. My name is Anne Ferdig, and I am the co-director for Jane Austen and Company. Tonight, I am joined by my co-director, Dr. Inga Brody, our co-host, Susan Allen Ford, and our technical director, Malika Amoroso. So say hello, everyone. And tonight, we're so excited to welcome Dr. Joseph Rezek, who will be speaking on Phillis Wheatley and her books, a very exciting topic that fits into our larger mission of talking about women who were contemporaneous with Jane Austen and their world. So as we're talking about reading with Jane Austen, we're also talking about reading with Phillis Wheatley.
And welcome to the fifth installment of this Reading with Jane Austen series. We'll tell you more about the upcoming events at the end.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Joseph Rezek. Joseph Rezek is an associate professor of English and director of American and New England Studies program at Boston University. He specializes in early and 19th century American literature, the history of the book, early Black Atlantic literature, transatlantic studies, British Romanticism, and the history of race and racism. Each year, he gives the annual Jane Austen Lecture for BU's core curriculum, which always focuses on Pride and Prejudice. He's the author of London and the Making of Provincial Literature, Aesthetics in the Transatlantic Book Trade from 1800 to 1850 from University of Pennsylvania Press. His work has also appeared in English literary history, American literary history, early American studies, early American literature, and in 2 volumes of the Cambridge University Press series, African American Literature in Transition. He's published extensively on Phillis Wheatley, and his talk today is drawn from a recent article, Transatlantic Traffic, Phillis Wheatley and Her Books, which was published in The Unfinished Book, a collection from Oxford University Press, edited by Alexander Gillespie and Deidre Lynch. His second book, The Racialization of Print, is under contract with Omohundro Institute for Early American History and Culture and the University of North Carolina Press. That book's going to tell a new story about the changing relationship between technologies of print and ideologies of race in the early Atlantic world. And I'll now hand things over to Malika to explain the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone. So throughout and after the presentation, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom center of your screen. Susan and Anne will then ask them to Joe. If you would like to chat with other attendees, as I see you're already doing, please continue to do that in the chat. But again, if you have questions for Joe that will be asked at the end of the talk, please put those in the Q&A.
Thank you so much. And without further ado, I'd like to hand things off to Dr. Joseph Rezek.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's really, really wonderful to be here. I wanted to thank Anne Ferdig, Susan Allen Ford, Ina Brody, and Malika Amoroso for hosting me tonight and inviting me to speak to you. I'm really thrilled and honored. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And it's a really wonderful time to think about Phillis Wheatley. It's a great moment in history to think about Wheatley. The study of Wheatley and the interest in her career is higher than ever. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the publication of her book of poems, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. If I can get my computer to switch slides. There we go. Which appeared in London in 1773. And here's the frontispiece from that famous book. There has been a flurry of interest in Wheatley in universities and in the broader public in recent years, especially following, I think, Honoré Fanon Jeffers' wonderful book of poetry, The Age of Phillis, an award-winning book from 2020. The moving exploration of Wheatley that tries to imagine what we cannot know about her life because of gaps in the historical record. Early American Literature, the scholarly journal, has just published its recent issue, a special issue about her work with scholarly essays, poetry by students, reflections on teaching, and a list of poems we might newly attribute to her. I've been publishing, writing, and teaching Wheatley for over a decade, and it really is thrilling to be surrounded by such a great community of scholars, including Tara Bynum, Bridget Fiedler, and Cassandra Smith, who did the special issue in early American literature, David Waldstreicher, who has a new biography coming out, The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, next month, Cornelia Dayton, Camille Owens, Britt Russert, Wendy Roberts, and many, many others. So today I will be talking about Wheatley's relationship to books, both as a reader and author. But for those of you unfamiliar with her career and her significance, I'll start with a brief overview of her life. And this will be about 3 or 4 minutes. And for those of you who know all about Wheatley, you can sit back and bask in her glory. Okay, so Phillis Wheatley, as many know, was the first author of African descent to publish a book of poetry in English. This book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. During her life, she gained an international readership on both sides of the Atlantic. Born in West Africa and kidnapped by slave traders when she was 6 or 7 years old, Wheatley was purchased by an evangelical family in Boston who taught her to read. She immersed herself in biblical and classical traditions and soon taught herself to write, publishing her first poem in a Rhode Island newspaper when she was a young teenager. A deeply religious poet who drew on John Milton and Alexander Pope, Wheatley was praised in her time by Voltaire, Benjamin Franklin, and George Washington. She's best known for writing about her experience of slavery and the slave trade, including the controversial poem On Being Brought from Africa to America. More recently, scholars have come to recognize and appreciate the wide diversity of Wheatley's work, including elegies and lyrics, hymns, and narrative poems inspired by the Old Testament and Ovid's Metamorphoses. Long recognized as the founding author of the African-American literary tradition, she's now considered one of the most important poets of the 18th century. Wheatley was brought to Boston in 1761 on the slave ship Phillis, after which her new enslavers, John and Susanna Wheatley, saw fit to name her, and that's where her name comes from, Phillis Wheatley. She first became famous in 1770 after the transatlantic reprinting of her elegy for George Whitefield, a founder of Methodism who preached frequently in North America and believed in the spiritual equality of Africans, although Whitefield himself was an enslaver. Wheatley soon advertised in Boston for subscriptions to a book of 28 poems, but was unable to gather enough support for publication in Boston. Great Britain, however, proved friendlier ground. While visiting London with her enslaver's son, Nathaniel, in the summer of 1773, Wheatley helped arrange for her book's publication under the patronage of Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, a Methodist leader who had Whitefield as her chaplain. Wheatley was celebrated in London by many prominent historical figures. She almost met the king, but didn't. But she soon returned to Boston after this trip to care for Susanna, who was sick. As a poet, this talk is not about her poetry, but I want to speak a little bit about what her achievement as a poet. Wheatley was particularly adept at the heroic couplet, which was the dominant poetic form of the 18th century. Her devotion to Protestant Christianity is revealed in elegies that exhort surviving relatives to seek comfort in the glory of salvation. As with Milton before her, Wheatley mingled biblical references with frequent allusions to Greek and Roman myth, often invoking the muses to her aid. A few meditative poems explore the workings of the mind, poems called On Recollection, On Imagination, while more explicitly political poems, such as To the Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth, display her commitment to freedom and equality. Wheatley's private letters to individuals and personal friends, including Albert Tanner, an enslaved Black woman living in Newport, Rhode Island, address her religious faith, her transatlantic travels, the sale of her book of poems, and her strident anti-slavery beliefs. Wheatley's poetry challenged Western culture's racist belief, evidenced in the writing of David Hume, Immanuel Kant, and Thomas Jefferson, that people of African descent were inferior to whites, even that Africans were fully less than human. Her patrons and publishers rightly assumed that many readers would be incredulous, that an enslaved woman and a native of Africa could have written a whole volume of poetry. Poems on Various Subjects thus includes a preface by Wheatley's enslaver verifying her authorship, and an attestation of her poetic abilities signed by 18 prominent Bostonians, including Thomas Hutchinson, who was then governor of the colony of Massachusetts, and John Hancock, the future signer of the Declaration of Independence. Her poetic achievement remained an important touchstone in debates about race and slavery well into the 19th century. Immediately after Poems on Various Subjects was published, many readers expressed outrage that such an accomplished poet was still enslaved. Responding to this pressure, John Wheatley manumitted her. Throughout the period of the American Revolution, she continued to write and publish poems, among them a panegyric laudatory poem for George Washington. The war, though, disrupted the transatlantic network of Methodist patrons, people like Whitefield and Huntingdon, that had supported her early career, and she never garnered enough support to publish a second book. She married John Peters, a free Black man, in 1778. Wheatley took her husband's last name as her own, thereafter publishing poetry and signing letters as Phillis Peters. The Peters were ambitious and resourceful, but the couple faced serious misfortune. It is likely they had at least one child who died in infancy, and John Peters was in prison for debt when Wheatley Peters herself died in 1784, sort of actually in relative obscurity when she died. Poems on Various Subjects received renewed attention beginning in the mid-19th century when Wheatley was adopted as an icon of the American anti-slavery movement. Okay, that biography actually is, if it sounds familiar to you, it's one that I wrote for the new Broadview Anthology of American Literature that prefaces her works in that new anthology. So I just thought I would read that to you since it is authored by me, although in the anthology that's not signed. Okay, so let's get into her books. And one way that I like to get into her books is to look at the things that she said about them. And in particular, one extraordinary letter that she wrote, a private letter that she wrote about her trip to London. After she got back to Boston in 1773, after this trip to London to oversee the publication of her books, she wrote to David Worcester in New Haven on October 18th, 1773. In that letter, she described her time in London and asked him to help sell copies of her new book, which had just been issued from the press. And here's the letter. It's at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is here in Boston, and I've seen it several times. The letter has been transcribed and printed in all of Wheatley's collected works, and I insisted upon including this letter in the Broadview Anthology because I think it's so important. When she got back to Boston, John Wheatley, her enslaver, freed her, and after her manumission, profits from the sale of her book would be her primary source of income. Wheatley's letter to Worcester explained all of this and also mentioned a number of books she acquired in London and brought back to Boston with her, including a folio edition of Paradise Lost. A folio is just a giant, big sort of coffee table sized edition of Paradise Lost by John Milton, which was presented to her by Brooke Watson, who then would become Lord Mayor of London. And also she brought home editions of Alexander Pope, Cervantes, and others, which she purchased herself. Wheatley's letter to Worcester is rich with implications for an understanding of her relationship to books as a reader and published author, an enslaved and freed person, and a transatlantic literary celebrity. It has much to teach us about Wheatley's relationship to the transatlantic publishing industry, the intimacy of gift economies, Wheatley's negotiation of English aristocratic patronage, and her unique status as an enslaved African poet. And as someone who's coming at Wheatley as a literary scholar, this talk will be a close reading of this letter, but the letter lets us go out to think about all the books that she owned and the book that she wrote. So the remainder of the talk will be in two parts. The first one will be Wheatley as book owner. And I'll focus on the books she acquired in London, many of which have survived to this day in research libraries with signed inscriptions. And the second part, I'll talk about Wheatley as a bookseller, thinking about her strategies for selling imported copies of Poems on Various Subjects in New England. And focusing on Wheatley's private correspondence, I follow particularly the example of Tara Bynum, who has argued for the importance of her letters. Wheatley's letter to David Worcester is her most significant private letter concerning books. I think it is one of the most important letters about books written by anyone in the 18th century. Okay. Who's David Worcester? David Worcester was an acquaintance of the Wheatley family. He was a soldier, a politician, and customs inspector from New Haven who fought in the French and Indian War and in the American Revolution, eventually achieving the rank of general. In 1778, Wheatley wrote a poem commemorating Worcester's death in battle near Danbury, Connecticut, which she sent to Worcester's widow, Mary. Wheatley's 1773 letter, addressed to Colonel David Worcester, was sent by way of a servant, quote, "who lives near you," Wheatley wrote, and who had just delivered good news of Worcester's family. The letter has three interrelated parts. The first is, quote, "a short sketch of my voyage and return from London." The second is an account, the only account, in Wheatley's words, of her manumission from slavery. And the third, a request for Worcester's help as a bookseller. Wheatley begins by reporting surprise at the goodwill she encountered in England. She was already a highly coveted guest because of her widely reprinted elegy of George Whitefield. As Wheatley tells Worcester, quote, "I was received in England with such kindness, complacence, and so many marks of esteem and real friendship as astonishes me on the reflection." She lists a number of new acquaintances, including the Earl of Dartmouth, who she'd written a poem about, other aristocrats, including Lady Cavendish, Lord Lincoln, Lady Carteret Webb, Mary Palmer, the poet, Daniel Solander, the botanist, Granville Sharp, the famous abolitionist, and Benjamin Franklin, who was in London at the time. Sharp, she wrote, attended me to the Tower and showed me the lions, panthers, and tigers. Wheatley's contacts and activities are fascinating in London, not least because of this tour of central London with Granville Sharp, who may have discussed Britain's abolitionist movement with her. In the letter, Wheatley also reports a few gift exchanges involving books. The Earl of Dartmouth made me a compliment of 5 guineas and desired me to get the whole of Mr. Pope's works as the best he could recommend to my perusal. This I did. I also got Hudibras, Don Quixote, and Gay's Fables, was presented with a folio edition of Milton's Paradise Lost, printed on a silver type, so called from its elegance, I suppose, by Mr. Brooke Watson, merchant, whose coat of arms is prefixed. So we've got about 10 minutes on these books coming up, okay? Okay, 5 editions referenced here in this sentence, in this passage, survive with Wheatley's inscriptions. Wheatley signed and dated The Gift of Paradise Lost, an expensive single-volume folio printed by Robert and Andrew Phillis in Glasgow in 1770. Mr. Brooke Watson to Phillis Wheatley, London, 1773. That's her handwriting there. And this book is at the Houghton Library at Harvard. Wheatley also inscribed books she bought with Dartmouth's money. Dartmouth gave her a gift and she went to the marketplace and bought some books. Wheatley's copies of Pope's Iliad and Odyssey from a combined octavo set published by John Whiston in 1771 include the following note in most of the 9 volumes. Lord Dartmouth to Phillis Wheatley, London, July 1773. Similar notes can be found in Wheatley's Complete Works of Alexander Pope, an octavo edition by Andrew Millar from 1766. Lord Dartmouth, Phillis Wheatley, London, 1773. In the only surviving volume of the Don Quixote she bought, which was a small format, 4-volume edition of Tobias Smollett's 1770 translation, she wrote Earl of Dartmouth to Phillis Wheatley, London. I've seen most of these books. I've seen the books that the middle book here, Lord Dartmouth to Phillis Wheatley, is at Dartmouth College. That is the same Dartmouth. The Earl of Dartmouth she's writing poems to is the same Dartmouth who founded Dartmouth College. They have a great Wheatley collection there, including some of these books. The Don Quixote volume is at the Schomburg Center at the New York Public Library, which I haven't seen in person, but they sent me images for my research. So all of these books that she purchased are by well-known canonical authors. Jane Austen, to pick a random person, for example, definitely would have read them all. Paradise Lost, Milton's epic about the fall of mankind in the Garden of Eden, and Don Quixote, the great comic novel, are the most famous. Alexander Pope, well known to you, probably less famous to others, was probably the most well-respected poet of 18th century Britain. He wrote many satires and philosophical works and rhymed heroic couplets, including The Rape of the Lock, The Dunciad, Essay on Man, all much anthologized works. Pope's translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey were bestsellers. They made him wealthy, and the likeliest way 18th century readers not trained to read ancient Greek would have experienced those epics. The books Wheatley mentions in her letter, which have not survived or we haven't found them yet, are Popular Moral Tales by John Gay and Samuel Butler's Hudibras, which is a satire that offers an anti-Puritan royalist view of the English Civil War. So enough of Wheatley's volumes survive to allow a number of observations and speculations about her relationship to them. What did these books mean to her? What characterized the intimate gestures that brought these objects into Wheatley's hands? There is actually, I think, an interesting tension between the exchanges that Wheatley reports in her letter to Worcester and the way Wheatley commemorated those exchanges through inscription, through the way that she wrote her name in the books. Their surviving volumes have similar gift inscriptions, even though they fall into three different categories. So direct gifts, Watson gave her the copy of Paradise Lost. It was his book, his coat of arms. He gave it to her, right? Books recommended by Dartmouth that he sort of funded the purchase of, such as the Pope's work, right? So Dartmouth gave her money, go buy the books, and she purchased them herself. And then books that Wheatley chose on her own, right? That she doesn't report in this letter that Dartmouth had recommended. The gift inscriptions on books Wheatley purchased with Dartmouth's money are easily explained as a tribute to the compliment that enabled her to buy them. But what I mean by this is that these books, it says, Lord Dartmouth to Phillis Wheatley. That's the middle image here. But it's not, he did not give her that book. He gave her the money to purchase the book, right? But it makes sense that she would honor him with this inscription because he funded the purchase of the book. What's interesting to me about that, though, is that these inscriptions erase Wheatley's activity in the marketplace, right? And some library records have identified these books as what we call in the trade presentation copies because of the way she signed them. So what people have thought about these books is that Dartmouth gave her the copy. This is his presentation copy of Alexander Pope. Well, actually, it's not. He gave her the money to purchase it, right? So they're not exactly presentation copies in the way that Brooke Watson physically gave her his copy of Paradise Lost. So instead of these direct gifts for the Pope editions, we must instead picture Wheatley making a series of very interesting choices during a kind of metropolitan shopping spree. And I picture her going to the book stalls in London or going around London trying to find books to buy, right? But if Dartmouth recommended someone like Pope, which is an obvious choice for Wheatley, is it likely he recommended Cervantes, who's a comic novelist, or Butler, a satirist, or even John Gay? Although we cannot know for certain, we do know that Wheatley told Worcester she picked the other books herself, right? She's making a distinction between books that were recommended to her and then books that she picked herself. I think these other books, so the third image here, the Quixote, I think these are arguably a rebuke to Dartmouth's taste. So while the moralistic fables of John Gay are perhaps closest to Pope, Don Quixote and Hudibras are very far. We do not commonly think of Wheatley as a novel reader, yet here she purchased an English novelist's rendition of Cervantes' Picaresque. And could Wheatley's well-known admiration for Milton have predicted this preference for Butler, right? So Butler and Milton are on opposite sides of the English Civil War. So she's bringing together both angles on that event. So Wheatley's account to Worcester, the letter she wrote, I think must be viewed as a highly self-conscious performance. Wheatley uses the list of books, right, to fashion a sophisticated literary persona. In the sentence about Dartmouth, Wheatley presents herself as a dutiful protege. This I did, she writes about buying Pope. But Pope was obviously already a great favorite of hers. Even if she bought the volumes as souvenirs or to reread, it is possible that when she mentioned Dartmouth's recommendation and then a series of contrasting works, she meant to issue a subtle critique of his predictable and rather condescending suggestion. So when we read the line, Pope was the best he could recommend to my perusal, it's almost as if she's joking, as if she expected more from him. Wheatley's comments about Watson, who gave her Paradise Lost, can also be read, I think, in multiple ways. Wheatley tells Worcester she was presented with Watson's copy of Paradise Lost, which highlights the formality of the exchange. She emphasizes the book's impressive materiality, its physical nature, a folio edition with elegant silver type and Watson's coat of arms prefixed. Some at the time called this edition of Milton the most magnificent book they'd ever seen, right? And its heft is evident when compared to Wheatley's own volume. And the Houghton Library has 2 copies of Wheatley's poems on various subjects. And so you can actually compare in size, and they took this beautiful photograph for me, that you can compare in size Wheatley's poems and then the copy of Paradise Lost that she owned, right? And you can see this endlessly fascinating comparison you can make between these 2 books. Not only is the Milton book, of course, much bigger, but you have the books here, both of them with frontispieces, right? Which is Wheatley's frontispiece as a rebuke to Milton being the kind of like big canonical author. Okay, but she has this slide reference to the book's silver type, the Paradise Lost book's silver type, so called from its elegance, I suppose, right? Which undermines the seriousness of the exchange by playfully hinting at the vanity of the book's luxury features, right? She's sort of like, oh, I suppose it's so elegant. I could just want to get the tone from Wheatley to be a little bit wry, not just totally straightforward here. Wheatley did not mention to Worcester that Granville Sharp gave her a copy of his Remarks on Several Important Prophecies, a book that does survive also with Sharp's own inscription dated to Phillis Wheatley, London, July 21. So she's telling Worcester, her correspondent, about some of the books she acquired in London, but not all of them. And finally, while Wheatley could have easily spent all of Dartmouth's 5 guineas on the books she mentioned here, she might also have purchased others she declined to mention. Like, which books did Wheatley buy that she's not mentioning here? 5 guineas is a lot of money. It's about, in today's purchasing power, it's about $1,500 to give someone 5 guineas in 1770. That said, books were much more expensive then. So it's not as if you can buy the same amount of books with $1,500 as you could buy in 1773 with 5 guineas, but still it's a lot of money. Let's look at these inscriptions even more closely. So I think these inscriptions, these gift inscriptions, also teem with complexity. They emphasize Wheatley's relationship to Dartmouth and Watson by commemorating their generosity to her, and they particularize that generosity in each volume by locating it in time and space. A printed book, as Natalie Zeman Davis has argued, is a carrier of relationships. Wheatley's inscriptions transform her books into personal tributes to her benefactors, and also objects that commemorate her trip to London. Her copies are otherwise pristine, completely devoid of marginalia. I have looked at every page of the books that I've seen in person, and I've asked librarians to look in the other ones, and there's no marginalia. The inscriptions, therefore, seem to function as companions to the book's title pages and other opening paratexts, as identifying words that frame their significance. Inscription, for Wheatley, hewed closely to the word's association with permanence, monumentalization, and the durable record, to quote from Roger Chartier. As such, these inscriptions, I think, hail posterity, the future, just like her poetry. Also like her poetry, Wheatley's inscriptions were creative acts, especially her inventive notes about Dartmouth. They're inventive, right, because she takes out the image of herself buying the books. If those inscriptions erased a scene of market exchange, Wheatley at the booksellers, they also invented a scene of intimate presentation. The inscriptions ask us to picture Wheatley accepting books from Dartmouth's hands, just as she did from Watson's. They reject the economics of the book trade in order to fashion and commemorate a direct exchange with Dartmouth. In an act of writing, we might understand not only as performative and inventive, but also audacious, Wheatley impersonates Dartmouth and presents these books to herself. For Wheatley, what mattered was the book's association with Dartmouth, not her use of a handful of pounds to acquire them. As was the case for many 18th century readers, the significance of a book resided not only in its physical presence and verbal content, but in the social relationships it embodied. So I've been calling these inscriptions, these notes, gift inscriptions, but they are also ownership marks, to use a technical term from bibliographers. So if you're a bibliographer or a rare books librarian and you have books in your collection, hundreds of them, you want to mark in your catalog whether they have any ownership marks. Did anyone sign these books? Take claim of owning them over time. According to H.J. Jackson, ownership marks reflect the impulse to make a claim, to stake a claim, sorry. And while such marks are relatively common in the 18th century, there would have been nothing common about Wheatley, still an enslaved person, when she purchased these books from following that impulse. So we do not know when she signed these books. We do not know if she waited until she was free to sign them, but whether they were aspirational claims to ownership or functional ones, these ownership marks are obviously about property. In that sense, they are akin to her poetry, not only metaphysically, as I've just suggested, but also in a practical way, as sources of wealth. These books were likely among Wheatley's most valuable possessions. The similarity of the inscriptions here in both content and form, so to Phillis Wheatley, London, 1773, suggests they may all have been written around the same time. Perhaps right away in London, right, to protect valuable property during her voyage home to Boston, or perhaps at a later date, much after she had returned, to take stock of her growing library. According to a note written in 1824 in the copy of Paradise Lost, Wheatley's husband, John Peters, sold that valuable book to settle debts after her death in 1784. There's a whole kind of associational history to be written about these books. How do they end up in the various research libraries that they ended up in? But this note says this book was given by Brooke Watson to Phillis Wheatley and then sold by John Peters. So Peters, who married Wheatley in 1778, could have sold it earlier. After they married, Wheatley's cherished books became Peters' legal property under the laws of coverture. And during their marriage, he was often in debtor's prison or running from creditors. If a woman married someone in the 1770s, their property became, right? This is something you know from Jane Austen. The fact that Wheatley's valuable books remained in her possession, even under her husband's financial duress, should suggest the strength of her attachment to them. She had these books until she died. She was not going to sell these books to settle her husband's debt. And I think that's fascinating. In the 1773 letter to Worcester, immediately after Wheatley describes her new property in books, she owns these books, she describes her newly acquired property in her own person. This is the letter's second and briefest section, and we're moving on here. For Wheatley, who owned not even herself, as Alice Walker wrote, the announcement marks an epoch in her life. While the transition in the letter seems abrupt, this about books is immediately followed by a sentence about freedom, there is in fact a deep logic to it. Wheatley invoked her freedom to stress that her ownership of these books was legitimate. Since my return to America, my master has at the desire of my friends in England given me my freedom. The instrument is drawn so as to secure me and my property from the hands of executors, administrators, etc. of my master, and secure whatsoever should be given me as my own. A copy is sent to I. Maudet, Esquire, FRS, Fellow of the Royal Society. Secure me and my property, these books. Wheatley's books were obviously an afterthought compared to the urgency of securing herself from slavery. To Worcester, however, in the letter, she defines liberty partly as the right to accept gifts. This casts her London acquisitions in a precarious light. Brooke Watson could hand her Paradise Lost, but what could stop her master from stealing it, right? Nothing. Only my freedom, Wheatley implies, guaranteed by a written instrument and its duplicate sent with trust to a member of the Royal Society. Wheatley's freedom has always been associated with books, especially the publication of poems on various subjects. Her letter to Worcester asks us not only to think of her as writing her way to freedom, but reading her way there too. Wheatley's ownership inscriptions transformed her books into artifacts of emancipation. Okay, Wheatley as bookseller. After her manumission in the fall of 1773, Wheatley was allowed to profit from the sale of poems on various subjects. That book made her one of the most famous women in the world. Reaping financial benefit from its sale, however, presented significant challenges. One was the absence of copyright protection in the colonies. The London printed book contains a copyright notice entered at Stationers' Hall, but protections did not extend to British North America. And if you've worked on the early American book trade, you would know, but why would you, that books were not copyrighted in North America, basically. So anything that appeared in London could be reprinted without payment or royalties in North America. So this was a problem for Wheatley, who's going to live off of the sale of her books, but anyone could reprint them. So Wheatley not only needed to seek out purchasers for her book, but also to devise a way to prevent its unauthorized reprinting. The stakes were high, as the profits were now to be her primary means of financial support, right? She's independent now, she's free, she has to support herself. She addressed this in the third and final section of her letter to Worcester. It is arguably the letter's most important passage, and one not yet recognized as Wheatley's opening bid to become a professional author. This is a long passage, but I'm sure you'll enjoy it. I expect my books, which are published in London, Captain Hall, meaning are published in London, they're expected in a vessel commanded by Captain Hall, who will be here, I believe, in 8 or 10 days. I beg the favor that you would honor the enclosed proposals and use your interest with gentlemen and ladies of your acquaintance to subscribe also, for the more subscribers there are, the more it will be for my advantage, as I am to have half the sale of the books. This I am more solicitous for, as I am now upon my own footing, and whatever I get by this is entirely mine, and it is the chief I have to depend upon. I must also request you would desire the printers in New Haven not to reprint that book, as it would be a great hurt to me, preventing any further benefit that I might receive from the sale of my copies from England. The price is 2 shillings 6 bound, or 2 shillings sterling sewed. If any should be so ungenerous as to reprint them, the genuine copy may be known, for it is signed in my own handwriting. This passage comes right after the passage where she says that she's free. Freed from slavery and from the constraints and protections of patronage, Wheatley now throws herself upon the mercy of readers. What were her strategies for success, and what did they mean to her? So in this passage, Wheatley describes selling books as a personal matter. In writing to Worcester, she sought to benefit from an extended network of friends defined by care. Writing for the first time as a freed person, Wheatley needed to reveal her direct financial interest in this case. Half the sale of the books are to be hers. And in the 18th century, it wasn't very common for authors to declare their financial interest in the sale of a book, right? But Wheatley needs to do that to tell her friend or the friend of her family, of her enslavers, to tell him that she gets the money from these books. She appeals to the personal advantage she would gain from subscriptions and asks Worcester to use your interest with gentlemen and ladies of your acquaintance. Her plea is direct, earnest, and urgent. I am now upon my own footing, and whatever I get by this is entirely mine. It is the chief I have to depend upon. Piracies would prove a great hurt to me, and so Wheatley developed a strategy that also hinged on her person. She decided to sign copies in my own handwriting in order to verify their status as genuine, right? So she's actually going to sign every copy she sells in New England, and only if you have this signed copy can you be sure as a reader that it's the genuine one. So Wheatley's remarks about bookselling, however, while couched in terms of personal intimacy and concern, are also filled with, I think, an ambitious kind of public confidence. Unknown authors were not vulnerable to piracy. Wheatley prepares for it because of her fame. She knows booksellers will be interested in her book, right? So this is about how confident she is in public interest in her writings. Her eager anticipation of copies from London frames their arrival as a literary event, which it was. In a letter overflowing with references to the metropolis, this passage is no exception. Copies from England are on the way. There's also arguably some pride in her discussion of sharing profits. This is not charity. Wheatley now has a job to protect and promote her book's genuine copy. The term genuine, like genius, has roots in the Latin word genere, meaning to beget or produce. Wheatley's use of genuine copy draws on the word's 18th century meaning associated with authorized printed texts, but it also alludes to her generative powers as a poet. Consider from this point of view, Wheatley's decision to sign her books. And here, again, at the Houghton, we have a signed copy of Wheatley's poems on various subjects. There are many, many signed copies that survive. I've counted 17 of them at various libraries all over the world. Most library catalogs describe the autograph as written on the verso of the title page, which is the reverse of the title page. So the title page is on the other side of this page where you see her signature. And so again, for bibliographers, you might say, oh, she signed the book on the reverse of the title page, right? This is true, but Wheatley has a different intention here. This is signed just below the copyright notice. So enters on Stationers' Hall, which I mentioned before, is the copyright notice for the book. And Wheatley signs it right below the copyright notice, right? This is a claim to her literary property. Her signature rebukes the notorious attestation that prefixed to her poems of the 18 white men who testified to her abilities as a writer, right? In the beginning of the book, you've got the 18 men, you've got John Hancock, Thomas Hutchinson. No, here we have Wheatley's name signed on the copyright page. In signing her book, Wheatley brushed aside the attestation and claimed the authority to ratify her own authorship and therefore her own humanity. So when Wheatley wrote to Worcester in this letter, her books were literally crossing the Atlantic. In that sense, these announced signatures were actually prospective in the future. Copies of poems on various subjects arrived in Boston about 1 month later than she expected, not in 8 to 10 days, but actually on November 29th, 1773, they arrived in Boston. Wheatley's appeal to Worcester was the first of several she wrote to friends to help her sell her book. I enclose proposals for my book, Wheatley wrote to her 2 weeks later to Albert Tanner in Newport, and beg you'd use your interest to get subscriptions as it is for my benefit. In February 1774, a few months later, Wheatley wrote to Samuel Hopkins, also in Newport, quote, to acquaint you of the arrival of my books for London, I have sealed up a package containing 17 books for you, 2 for Mr. Tanner, and 1 for Mrs. Mason, and only wait for you to appoint some proper person by whom I may convey them to you. I received some time ago 20 shillings sterling upon them by the hands of your son in a letter from Albert Tanner. In March of that year, Wheatley told Tanner she, quote, shall send the 5 books you wrote for, and 2 months later, she confirmed she received the money you have sent for the 5 books, 2 shillings 6 more for another. In May, Wheatley announced to Hopkins that I have received in some of the last ships from London 300 more copies of my poems, and I wish to dispose of them soon as possible. Meanwhile, Sampson Occam, the Mohegan minister, sold copies in Connecticut. And the point here is that she's selling her book. She's writing letters. Book by book, she's selling them. So book selling in the colonial period in North America often depended upon a tenuous and unreliable process based on credit, trust, and direct interpersonal transactions. And it is unclear whether Wheatley received money only from the copies she sold herself or also from those sold elsewhere in North America or in England. We don't quite know how much money she made from this book. She continued to sell copies for the next several years as she wrote new poems intended for a second volume. And one final thread connected to Wheatley's 1773 letter to Worcester can be traced to the note and poem she sent to his wife after his death in the American Revolution. And I mentioned this at the beginning. This is the note she wrote to his wife, Mary, which included an elegy. The elegy for General Worcester celebrates his warlike deeds, Christian virtues, and the principles of freedom for which he died. It starkly questions, though, the legitimacy of the American Revolution, while its proponents still, quote, disgrace and hold in bondage Afric's blameless race. The poem's weighty concerns with death, freedom, salvation, slavery, and the future of a nation stand in contrast to a practical request that ends the letter. You will do me a great favor, she asks Mary Worcester, by returning to me the first opportunity, those books that remain unsold, and remitting the money for those that are sold. I can easily dispose of them here. If we assume this was not the first contact between Wheatley and the Worcester family since 1773, then we can picture an intimate correspondence about books that extended over several years. We can also picture Wheatley's continuing struggle to profit from such traffic, as well as a refreshing and admirable amount of self-confidence. I can easily dispose of them here, she writes, eager as ever to make her poetry the anchor for a sustainable life. So to conclude, Wheatley's relationship to books was in many ways exceptional. Francis Smith Foster long ago wrote that as an African writing in the 18th century, Wheatley's poetry was a political act. Likewise, the mere fact that she claimed ownership of books challenged the racialized hierarchies of her time. And yet the intimacies characterizing her relationship to books were also in many ways broadly representative. Transatlantic traffic in books was individual as well as institutional, dependent on material exchanges between persons known to each other, as well as anonymous business transactions, governed by personal taste, whim, and opportunity, as well as impersonal market forces. As Abigail Williams has recently reminded us, reading was sociable. This was true for Wheatley as an enslaved person who had access to literacy and libraries in Boston, as much as it was for her as the owner of valuable books she associated with eminent friends in London. Wheatley embraced the sociable nature of reading from the beginning of her poetic career by writing occasional verse that circulated in manuscript to friends and acquaintances. Later, as the author and owner of printed books, she continued to envision reading as an activity imbued with the interpersonal significance books acquired through exchange. She marked her books as genuine by signing them, ensuring that each reader, either of a book she owned or a copy of the book she wrote, felt her presence as part of their experience. We have long understood Wheatley's reading through her poetry, awash as it is with allusions to ancient and modern classics. Her letter to Worcester invites us to picture her with books in her hands, books we can hold in our hands today, and ask what it meant for her to receive them as gifts, to carry them across the Atlantic, to claim them with signatures, to send them to readers, and ultimately to offer them to posterity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that wonderful talk. That was just fascinating.
Thank you.
And I love all the different points you brought up. As we move into the Q&A, I want to remind everyone that there's still time to drop your questions into the Q&A box for us to ask Dr. Rezek about his talk. So what I would like to point out first is, I think as you brought up, right, you can tell just by reading her poetry how well read she is because of all the classical allusions that are in it. You know, it's very apparent, even just reading the poems, that she has read widely. And so we have someone who is asking, how did Phillis, as an enslaved woman, learn these classical allusions and these classical sources? What was her education like?
That's that's a great question. What is her education like? So a lot of people have tried to figure out where she's reading books, as the Wheatleys may have had a modest library, but we're not quite sure of what they would have had in it. They were part of the Boston elite, though, and she would have had access to private libraries around Boston. She's not going to any universities. She's not going to any. There really weren't any public libraries in the 18th century. So she's not going to subscription libraries, but she probably has access to private collections. There's not really a lot of evidence of the actual books she would have read during her education, but we're presuming that Susanna Wheatley borrowed books from friends, and that she read them there. But yeah, certainly before she's acquiring any of these books in London, she's read them all already. I mean, or at least, Milton and Pope and everyone for sure, as people have mined her poetic works for references to all of those. But she was a voracious reader and learned immediately and was reading constantly.
Just to follow up on that, do we know anything about when she actually learned to read and write?
So, there's a brief biography of her at the beginning of the poems, written by her master, John Wheatley, and he says that they taught her to read pretty soon after she arrived. So she would have been 6 or 7 years old to read English. And they said that, so within a few years she was reading, and then within a few years after that she was writing. So she was writing probably around age 10 or 11. She published her first poem at age 17 in a newspaper. Although Wendy Roberts, a scholar from the State University of New York at Albany, has just found a poem that predates that newspaper poem, and she may have written poems as young as 15 or 16 for sure.
What you've been saying about her way of asserting her authority by signing her name to the book under the copyright is so fascinating. Was this book reviewed? And what were the reviews like? And is that part of what might have made this a sort of necessity for her? I mean, psychologically. And you mentioned sort of the front matter of the book with lots of men saying things about her. Can you talk a little bit more about all that?
Yes, sure. So Wheatley became famous before her book was published. So in 1770, she wrote an elegy for George Whitefield. And George Whitefield was an extremely, extremely famous evangelical Methodist who was popular in both Britain and the United States. And he toured everywhere. He was a writer, he was a celebrity, and he died in 1770. And she wrote a poem commemorating his death that was reprinted all over North America and in Britain. This elegy for Whitefield. So, and she was famous because she was young when she wrote this poem, and she was born in Africa, right? And she was an enslaved person. So her celebrity is really tied to that event in 1770. She was well known in Boston also as someone who would write poems occasionally for about events in Boston and in newspapers and things. So she's building a reputation as a poet before 1773 when her book is published. No one in Boston will print this book because it's a racist place, and no one would believe, their publisher would not invest money in a project that people would be so incredulous about, right? And an enslaved girl African is going to write all these poems. No one would believe her. But the Wheatley family, her enslavers, they had ties to a lot of very rich Methodists in England. So Whitefield was a personal chaplain to the Countess of Huntingdon, who was a great British aristocrat, an enslaver herself, right? But she was fascinated by Wheatley, and agreed to be the patron for this book, and in London. But even though they had an aristocratic patron in England to fund the book, books are expensive, to fund the publication of the book, they still needed to get this written attestation by 18 white men to vouch for Wheatley as a poet, as someone who's educated enough to write these poems. Mm-hmm. So the Wheatley family circulated a petition in Boston. It was formerly believed that maybe there had been an oral examination of Wheatley in front of these 18 white men, that she had to pronounce her poetry or declare her knowledge of Ovid and Homer and Pope and everything. But really it was a manuscript petition that the Wheatleys passed around Boston, that these men signed. And they're the most famous men in Boston: Thomas Hutchinson, John Hancock, this Samuel Mather, really big guys in Boston. And they signed this paper. The paper then was on display at the bookseller's office in London when Wheatley's poems was published. So they printed the names of the 18 white men in front and said, these men say that Phillis Wheatley wrote these poems. If you would like to view the manuscript signed copy of this attestation pledge, go to the bookseller's office and you can find it. So this is what she's battling, right? No person of African descent had ever published a book of poetry in English before. So this is what she's battling. And so there was a lot of interest in her. When she goes to London, when she leaves America for London in June of 1773, she publishes a poem about going to London. And that poem is reprinted all over North America. When she gets to London, she almost meets the king. So she's already very famous when this book is coming. Everyone knows it's coming. Everyone knows that she wrote the book. when it's published, you asked about, so the front matter is really just all the stuff that the publisher thought would be necessary to convince readers all over the English-speaking world that she would have written the book. So it was reviewed initially very favorably as like an interesting experiment. Oh my goodness, what a genius, what a prodigy. There was immediately, though, of course, a backlash against her, judgments of her poetry ranged wildly from, oh, she's just imitating, oh, she couldn't have written, I don't believe for a second she wrote these poems. Oh, even though she wrote them, she's imitating, they're terrible poems. She's imitating British verse. She's got no originality. She's got no, nothing to say. The most famous person to write about reading her poems was Thomas Jefferson, who in Notes on the State of Virginia is looking for excuses to prove the inferiority of African people to justify the institution of slavery. And he points to Phillis Wheatley and he says, Phillis Wheatley, these poems are beneath the dignity of criticism, right? They're not really poetry. Religion could produce Phillis Wheatley, but she's not a poet. So he dismissed her in order to denigrate Black people. And so that is probably the most famous reading of Wheatley that then in the 19th century became a rallying cry for Black authors to disprove, right? Not only that Wheatley was an original poet and a genius, right? But that Black people were human and they could write poetry. So Jefferson's reading of Wheatley in Notes on the State of Virginia, he read her alongside Ignatius Sancho, who was another Black writer at the time, was really influential in setting some of the terms for Wheatley's reception. And then in the 19th century, she was claimed by Black writers as a progenitor, right, as an originary person and a genius, and then by abolitionists to prove the injustice of slavery because of her genius.
Do we know anything about, I mean, I imagine she saw those reviews.
Do we know anything about how she wouldn't have seen Jefferson's because she died in 1784 and Jefferson's Notes in the State of Virginia were published that year in 1784. She would have seen notices of her work in newspapers and opinions from people. What we know about her life after the publication of this book is that she's, again, as I outlined in this paper, she's selling her books to people, and also she's writing more poetry. So she kept writing poetry, publishing poetry, sending poetry to people. She wrote a poem to George Washington. She circulated proposals for a second book that she was dedicating to Benjamin Franklin. So she became a patriot during the war and hopes to have a great poetic career. The war, of course, was a war. It was very disruptive and very difficult for her to keep her footing and sell her books. She was a refugee of the war from Boston, living in Rhode Island. She comes back to Massachusetts, and Cornelia Dayton, the historian I mentioned at the beginning, has located the Wheatleys, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley in Middletown, Massachusetts, where they were living on a farm, trying to make their way in the world, and she was writing poetry. We don't have a lot of the letters that we have from her that survive do not comment upon the reception of her poetry, though. They're mostly about her life and her prospects and writing more poems.
Thanks.
So you've mentioned a few times that she was the first person of African descent to publish a book of poetry in English. We have a question here about her, literary or intellectual circles within the African American community at that time. And I'd like to kind of broaden that out to ask, what was African American literature at this time? And do we know if Phillis Wheatley was interacting with any other writers, published or not published at the time, who were participating in these same intellectual conversations?
Definitely. She has a rich community of people in New England that she's interacting with, some of whom are writers. Jupiter Hammond wrote a poem to her and she knew him. Scipio Moorhead is an artist, a Black artist, a painter in Boston who she wrote a poem about, who many people suspect that the portrait at the front of her poems would have been based on a painting of his. She has a friend, literate religious friends, Black friends in Rhode Island. Albert Tanner is her great correspondent and friend who's writing to her. Albert Tanner was not a writer herself, not a poet. We don't know that she was a poet. None of Albert Tanner's papers survive, actually, but they're corresponding about religion, about the Bible, about the revolution, about lots of different things. Tara Bynum, who's the scholar I mentioned at the beginning as kind of inspiration for my work on Wheatley's letters, has done a lot of research on the Black community that she was a part of in New England. So there's a really rich intellectual community and a really rich community of kind of interlocutors and thinkers. Samson Occam was a Mohegan preacher. He's obviously not of African descent, but he was a writer, and they corresponded, and her first writings were to him. And he was also involved with these Methodists that Wheatley was involved in. So she has a broad community. 18th century African American literature is fascinating because they're the great big printed texts that we have that are often seen as the most literary. Wheatley's poems. I mentioned Ignatius Sancho, who wrote many letters. He was that his letters were published after his death in 1782. He read Wheatley's work. We don't know if Wheatley was aware of him exactly. A lot of Equiano from later publishing his autobiography. These are big printed books that we teach in literature classes. But African American literature is not just the printed things, right? So there are letters going back and forth. There's oral culture. There's all kinds of modes of expression in the early period that are not tied to things that end up getting printed in giant books, right? So and Wheatley is engaging with a lot of that tradition, and a lot of those traditions and modes of expression as well.
And can you talk as a literary historian, how in your work do you find those voices that might not have been published, right, in these big works? Like, how do you recover these communities that might have become silenced over time?
Well, you go find things, right? So for example, I was doing research into Wheatley and her life, and this network of British evangelical Methodists and people like the Countess of Huntingdon, George Whitefield. They were like liberal for their time, meaning they believed that they wanted everyone. They believed everyone could get saved, right? And they were a threat to the established church because poor people, illiterate people, anyone can be saved, even illiterate people, right? And so the kind of established church, radical Protestants here in New England too, would have thought, Puritans, oh no, you need literacy. So the Whitefield and his group, anyone can be saved. So people of African descent, Native Americans, they can be saved even if they're illiterate. So they have an interest in these groups. I was doing research into them and found an article about a Black preacher named David Margret, who never published anything in print. But he was a preacher who the Countess of Huntingdon sent to Georgia, where she had a plantation and an orphanage, to preach the word of God to enslaved people, not to free any of them, but to preach the word of God to them. And so there's an article a historian wrote about this figure, David Margret, based on a bunch of letters that all these white people associated with the Countess of Huntingdon wrote about him, to do a history of this preacher. So I went to look at all these letters in the Westminster College in Cambridge, England, and started thinking about him as a writer. And so I've written about him as a writer because these white observers who are watching him in Georgia, and he gave kind of incendiary speeches. He actually preached liberation and was fired from the Huntington Connection, from this group. But his reported speech in their letters, for me now, are texts to be analyzed as early Black literature, because they report what he said. And he said to enslaved people in Georgia, you will be liberated from slavery, just like in Exodus. So he's preaching liberation, and we have fragments of reported speech by, again, these white observers who are trying to silence them. So that involves looking at the archive, what's available, and kind of reading against the grain of how the archive was created to find voices like this. So there's a lot of different ways to find voices and to find other modes of expression than the big ones that are printed and obvious to us as literature. But there's lots of different ways to go. Tara Bynum has written about a list of goods that an acquaintance of Wheatley had purchased for a party, a pig roast, and has written about that as literature. So there's a lot of different ways. It's a very exciting field because there's a lot of different creative ways that you can think about the archive as literary, right? Without them being published text. That's sort of what I'm doing with the letter to Worcester. I mean, it's one letter, but I'm taking 45 minutes to talk about it, right? So that's a close reading of a letter, which is a literary activity, right? And you can get at different things rather than just looking at the printed books that are traditionally understood that way.
Thank you.
Listening to you talk about the book, her book, as contested in terms of authority and legitimacy, ownership, all those things, I couldn't help continue thinking about the book as a body, with the terminologies of having a head and a foot and a spine, and all there's and this. I wondered to what extent this kind of embodied understanding of the book from feminist studies, etc., influences your reading or your understanding of it, because it really does seem to correspond well with her sense of a contested body and ownership of her own self.
That's a great point. And Kristen Wilcox has a great essay called "The Body into Print" about Phillis Wheatley, thinking about embodiment and the printedness of her book. The book with her frontispiece, I mean, it sort of stands in for her body in a lot of ways, right? And you can, when Thomas Jefferson holds the book and judges her, he's judging her body. He's placing her body in a certain denigrated position based on the book. And the book is, all the way back to the early modern period, books have been metaphors of the book have been about the body, right? Fragments, destroying the book, putting the book together. Editing is bringing different fragments of the body together into one whole. So I think what she's really doing, and this is what people have been saying about Wheatley for centuries, she's challenging all the things that people understood that books were, right? So I show the Milton picture because that's what a book is. It's a white male author being canonical, and she's challenging everything about that with her book by being a Black author, an enslaved author, a woman author, with the picture of her on the front. It was her patron, the Countess of Huntingdon, who insisted upon a portrait, and we need a portrait of Wheatley. We need a frontispiece, and I think that is the Countess, who's a complicated figure. That is the Countess. I'm waving to my children who are in the other room. Okay, that is the Countess of Huntingdon. Knowing that this connection you're suggesting between the book and the body would have been powerful to readers. You need to see the person, right, to really fully grasp the significance of the object. Right.
Can I just follow? There's a couple of specific factual questions that viewers have asked.
Okay.
Whether basically what job was she destined for when she was enslaved and purchased, and also if you could say a little more about the fate of her husband.
Sure. So Wheatley, it's truly horrifying to think about the tiny child Phillis Wheatley being kidnapped and brought to Boston. So she was 6 or 7 years old, and she writes about this in her the poem to Dartmouth that I mentioned, the Epistle to Dartmouth, where she imagines her being ripped from her father's arms by a slave trader, and when enslavers in the 18th century had children on the Middle Passage, I mean they sell them cheaply as to be domestic workers or to be brought up to be field workers. They're expendable. Children are expendable in the slave trade. Enslavers in the 18th century wanted strong men, mostly. So the fact that Wheatley was brought as a child is sort of, there weren't a lot of children who were brought. It's not for the perspective of an enslaver, it's not a valuable thing to do. So Susanna Wheatley, though, went to buy a servant at the marketplace. She's an enslaver, like she has been for a long. So sometimes at Wheatley scholarship, she's seen as a kind of sympathetic figure because she taught Wheatley how to read. No, she's buying a person at market and cheaply because that she's a child. So the logic for Susanna Wheatley in doing that is then to bring her up in the family as a servant. So slavery in Boston was mostly, was a small scale endeavor compared to the sort of like sugar plantations in the Caribbean. So in Boston, slavery would have been domestic slavery, where you have someone who's a servant or a skilled worker or someone working a printing press, something like that. So there's small scale slavery happening in Boston. And Wheatley herself she was a servant. She was a domestic servant. So she would have been serving meals, cleaning the house, and so on when she was old enough to work. And so that was her function in the Wheatley home until she started, and then she started writing poetry. So she would write poetry. Their friends would come over, people would visit the Wheatleys, and Susanna Wheatley would say, "Oh, we have our Phillis here. She's our slave." In her terms, she would say our servant. She can write poetry. What should she write about? And so guests to the Wheatley family home would give her subjects, and it was kind of a parlor performance where she would then write poems in front of people. And she wrote elegies about children. There's a lot of great work on Wheatley childhood. Camille Owens has a great essay on Wheatley childhood in the new special issue. So thinking about Wheatley as a child, Bridget Fiedler writes about Wheatley as a child, thinking of her in that space as young, as literate, as a poet is really fascinating. But she was a domestic servant. So John Peters, the person she married, was a free African-American man who kind of did lots of different work in Boston. And I'm actually not going to pretend to remember the jobs that he had or what his profession was, because I don't quite remember. But they married and they lived, again, as recent research has shown, they lived in Boston, they lived outside of Boston in Middleton, Massachusetts. And he, though, was sort of a problem in a way because he got into a lot of debt. So he was in prison for debt, and he was in trouble for debt. And that sort of was difficult for them. And he was also very litigious, involved in the courts, sort of suing people for things and being sued for things. And so he did try to help Phillis Peters, his wife, write poetry. So the evidence we have now about their life in the 1780s, the early 1780s, they were living on a farm. This is all from Cornelia Dayton's new research. They were living on a farm. She was writing poetry while he was working, and they were trying to kind of get the farm together. That was a farm that was owned by John Peters' former enslavers before he was freed. But they never kind of got it together to support her career because he was sort of in trouble a lot. The John Peters had a kind of his reputation has improved in the last decade, or the last even 3 or 4 years. For a long time, he'd been seen as a real villain, as someone who ruined her life. In the 19th century, there was lore about him being really mean to Wheatley and destroying her career, being really jealous and in jail all the time. But recent research has shown that that's a caricature, and probably a racist caricature, and that he did his best for her. And Honoré Jeffers' book, The Age of Phillis, really goes into John Peters and thinking about how, this is the person that Phillis chose for a husband. Like, maybe they were in love. We know that they lost at least one child, maybe more than one child, and we should think of him more sympathetically. And that's what people are doing now. And Cornelia Dayton is writing more about him, and we'll learn more about him in the years to come.
Thank you.
We have a couple of related questions. You had talked about in the first part the the books that she chose after the Pope edition that Dartmouth recommended, Gay's Fables and Hubert and Don Quixote. Mm-hmm. Do we know anything more about any of the other books that she might have owned during her lifetime? And can you say anything more about why she selected those particular books? I mean, Gay's Fables, for instance, was anthologized a lot, especially in educational things for kids and others. But
so there are a few other books that she owned that have survived with her marks in them. The book by Granville Sharp's book I mentioned that he gave to her. And there are a few others that I'm actually forgetting that aren't mentioned in the letter, the Worcester letter. Presumably these books survived because of her signature, right? So there could be, or we identified the books because she signed them. We know these were her books; those are her signatures. There could have been other books she didn't sign that who knows if they survive or where they are or what they are, right? They wouldn't have been worth preserving, or no one would have known they're hers. The library, her library. I mean, I saw the library. It just means like a bunch of books she owned. There's a lot of work to be done too about when they were sold. Did she sell some of them during her life, or did they survive until her death and then John Peters sold them all? There's a lot of them seem to have connections with a family in Salem, the Dudley family. And there's a lot of, subsequent ownership marks, what I call ownership marks, where the Dudleys have signed these books as having been in their possession after Wheatley's life. And it's a Dudley who gives the Paradise Lost book to Harvard. So in 1824, so that how all the books end up, where they're sold, there's something about Salem happening. We know that Salem was where John Peters had a lot of legal activity. So there's something to be done with that history. In terms of why she's picking the books, I mean, I love this selection of books. I've done a lot of thinking about it. She's reading Don Quixote. I mean, it's Don Quixote is a novel. It's maybe the only novel we know that she read. Or that she owned. She probably read lots of novels. You don't brag about reading novels in the 18th century if you're like a pious woman like Phillis Wheatley, right? So, but she's telling Worcester that she bought Don Quixote. I mean, it was a canonical work, so it's not that shocking, but it's just great to think of her going to the novel or going to satire in these ways. And it's not just like the stuffy old epics of that you would think, or that Dartmouth had recommended to her. So I think she's just a brilliant literary person, and she wants a lot of different books. I mean, it's sort of like might even be that simple. I haven't done. I've thought about just reading her later work to see if there are any new influences may have been from this trove of books that we can trace, and that would be really interesting to see. Obviously she had read all of Pope or before she owned the books, but maybe there's some of the works for children, or some of the attitudes of Quixote that may have then made their way into the later poems. I think that would be a great research question for somebody, but I haven't done that work myself, but it would be really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So we have a great question about marginalia, and specifically about, if you can speculate about why Phillis Wheatley did not write as much marginalia in her books, especially in comparison to someone like, say, Jane Austen, who we do have quite a bit of surviving marginalia from. Why do you think it was that she didn't really mark up her books?
So obviously the first thing I wanted to see was like, what did she do in the pages of these books, right? So I looked at every page that I could, and they're not marked up. I don't know actually what explains the lack of marginalia. It's like negative evidence, right? So there's not. It's how do you explain something that didn't happen? They were the most valuable things among the most valuable things a person can own in the 18th century would be a giant folio edition of Paradise Lost, right? That is extremely valuable object. So maybe there's a sense of a piety around it, or a sense that you don't want to deface the book, or decreases value. I mean, I think that might have been something that was of a concern, but it's sort of they seem well read. I mean, they're not like I've seen books from the period that are obviously not been opened. These have been read. I mean, from what I can tell, but she just doesn't have her pen in her hand when she's working through them. They could also have been, as many people today own books just for their object value. I went to London, look at my books from London, I'm not going to read those. I'll borrow books that I'll actually read. These are not only just valuable objects, but books that commemorate her great tour. I mean, it's unusual for anyone in North America to go to London and nearly meet the king. And, so she's got this trove that's valuable to her. And she's claiming them as her own through the inscriptions.
Looks like we only have time for a couple of questions. Susan, you have some marked. Do you want to go ahead with those?
Oh, do I? Well, I was going to ask something else. I don't know. I think I've taken care of mine. Was her involvement in sales typical of an American author of that period, or a woman American author of that period?
So there weren't a lot of women who published books like this in the 18th century. There only Anne Bradstreet published a book of poems before her, and there's some other poems, religious texts, and so on. Mary Rowlandson published a captivity narrative. I mean, there are lots of books by women, but in terms of someone really earning a living by selling books like this, person to person, I think it's probably pretty unique for the period, for her to be, writing so diligently to all of her acquaintances, getting the income from her books, to be a professional author. Professional authors were very rare in the 18th century. The most authors, I mean, you could earn a living with books, but most authors who are writing books are earning livings some other way. Benjamin Franklin was a great author, but he's earning a living by being a printer, right? So all of the great political figures of the American Revolution are not making money from their writings. They have appointments, they have money in their families, they own plantations. Thomas Jefferson is not making money from his books. He owns a giant plantation. So I think it's very rare to try to become a professional author, and for a woman especially, extremely rare and extremely difficult. And that's one reason why I'm so fascinated. She's really acting like a bookseller here. In terms of 18th century booksellers, they are definitely writing to each other saying, please sell my books. We have a certain share. I get half the profits. You get half the profits. Send me your books. Like, I've read a lot of correspondence among booksellers who try to sell books to different readers. And this reads a lot more like a bookseller selling the books written by somebody else than an author personally asking their friends and acquaintances to subscribe.
Very interesting.
That's why I think the letter is like, one of the most important letters written by anybody about books, not only because it's for her, but she's buying books. It's the only moment where she talks about her manumission from slavery. And then she's saying, I'm signing these copies so that I can have an income. So it's really, encapsulates so much that's unique about her life, about authorship, about her role in 18th century, literary culture, and her just significance as a historical figure as well.
I mean, you're right. It's ownership and authority that works through that whole letter. It's really fascinating.
And thank you so much, Joseph, once again, for just
great.
a fascinating talk.